we'll take some politics out of the discussion now, and we're going to have another panel discussion. First, we have Belinda Field, who is the CEO of the Yerin, Eleanor, Duncan Aboriginal Health Services. Belinda is a proud Wiradjuri woman born on the lands of the Durag people of the Eora Nation, and she's moved to the Central Coast, the Duncan country, nearly 40 years ago. Belinda has been a board member of a number of organisations and is currently the Central Coast Local Health District. She represents the local Aboriginal community at senior levels of government, and we're very lucky to have her today. Now, I'm going to move over chairs. We also have with us today Jenni Beetson-Mortimer, who is the CEO of the Northern Rivers Community Gateway. So we're really happy to have some insights of what's happening up in Lismore from Jenni. Jenni is also the chair of the New South Wales Financial Inclusion Network and a board member of Homelessness Australia. Since 2000, Jenni has worked in leadership roles within the NGO sector as a CEO, manager, planner and community development worker. Jenni has a strong commitment to social justice, financial inclusion, ending homelessness and grassroots community services that provide true wraparound holistic services to disadvantaged people. So welcome. We also have today Esta Paschalidis-Chilas, the CEO of Canterbury City Community Centre. She was previously a Canterbury City Councillor and has more than 30 years experience working in multicultural public health advocacy, government relations, policy and strategy. She is co-founder of Settlement Services International, one of Australia's largest humanitarian settlement organisation, and is a former chairperson of the Refugee Council of Australia. So welcome and thank you for being here. Now, we also have, we have Andrew McAnulty here, and I have lost my sheet, and I'm very sorry here this is an absolute fail by me. I'm very sorry. But we have Andrew McAnulty, and we're very happy to have you. You are the CEO of Link Wentworth. Andrew has delivered social, affordable and large-scale urban renewal projects for more than 25 years across Australia and the United Kingdom. His experience highlights the innovation and vision required to create cutting-edge outcomes for projects which link the government, the private sector and community housing sector. So all the housing we've spoken about today, we're really happy to have you here, Andrew. So welcome all, and I'm going to start with you, Jenni, just in terms of we were just coming off the back of Lismore and what has been happening up there. And look, I was up there for the first week after the floods happened, and it was very clear to me that it was an absolute mess on the ground. Nobody knew who was in charge and what was happening. And I know that has been an ongoing issue. Yes, there's been funds offered, there's money in the budget. Is it enough at this stage? And are you confident that it's going to go where it's needed?
Thanks. I'd also like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that we meet today and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I'd also like to acknowledge two other Aboriginal women here today, Wendy and Michelle from Bunjalung. I guess, you know, in terms of the budget and in terms of funding towards the Northern Rivers, our area is just a disaster zone at the moment. In Lismore, my organisation, as well as Wendy and Michelle's organisation, side by side, are in the CBD of Lismore, and we've just totally devastated. We have it's not that we had an option for insurance, and it's not that we had, it's not that it was cost prohibitive. We actually weren't eligible for insurance. So after the 2017 flood, we couldn't get it at all. So for not-for-profits, for people in their own homes, for the 3,000 businesses and the 3,600 homes that have been deemed uninhabitable at the moment, we can't find funding to provide. I know that DCJ announced $13.3 million for the community sector, and my understanding from a meeting last week is part of that has actually been allocated already, and so it's actually only 7.6 million that's actually coming out to our sector. Now, and it's for 12 months. So for our organisation, I guess, I would actually say, from my perspective, in terms of funding, it's about the impact. So my understanding is that funding may be available to organisations that aren't directly impacted by the flood. So they're not, the water hasn't come through their premises. They might have, so it should be about the impact and who actually has suffered as a result of that flood. And it's been devastating. It's going to be really difficult for us as organisations to get back together. Most of the shops in the Lismore CBD are closed, boarded up. Very few have opened up again, and it's probably going to be a couple of years before everyone gets back to normal. So I guess I would say, when I look at my organisation as a neighbourhood centre, and I looked at this only a couple of days ago, we get from DCJ as our core neighbourhood centre funding, we get $127,000. Now, as part of that, we're expected to see, this is pre-flood, 3,000 people to provide information and referral, 300 people to provide advocacy and support. So that's intake and assessment. We're to run 3 networks a year. So that's, monthly meetings, to run 5 events, like for Harmony Day, for NAIDOC Week, for Social Inclusion Day, Neighbourhood Centre Week, to do a community consultation and to have a community plan. So that's the work for $127,000. Now, I've been in my role for about 11 years, and that $127,000 may have increased by 10 over those last 11 years. So, yes, we might get some additional funding for a year, but after that we go back. And the impacts of the flood are going to be far-reaching than 1 year. But the base funding that we get and we're the organisations that stand up the minute this event happens. We're there. Even though our premises was inundated by the floods, we were able to move to Gunnellabar. We had a disaster plan in place. We now provide emergency relief, food, clothing, fuel vouchers, chemist vouchers, a range of things, heating, vouchers for heaters, electric blankets for vulnerable community members. And our numbers have increased significantly since the flood. But what I would say is, pre-flood, our funding just wasn't suitable.
I'll go to you now, Belinda. Now, obviously, Aboriginal community controlled organisations have done incredible work during the pandemic, keeping vulnerable members of the community safe and advocating on their behalf. Now, in this budget, $10.1 million was promised over 4 years to embed culturally appropriate models of mental health care into the New South Wales health system to improve mental health outcomes for First Nations people. Is this going to help? Do you like the model? What do you see? How do you see this playing out?
Thank you. I'd also like to acknowledge country and acknowledge my fellow sisters in the room who are formidable leaders back in their communities. Thank you. I think it's not going to work, and I'll put it out there straight up. And I've done some maths, and I am not like, this is me using my calculator on my phone. It equates to, so you look at 15 LHDs across New South Wales, it works out probably about $146,000 if they distribute it to each of the LHDs. Now, the issue that I have with the budget allocation is it seems to be this cycle of government that if something's not working, they go in and fund the same thing and call it something else. It's interesting that it's the Aboriginal community-controlled health sector and our other Aboriginal community-controlled organisations that do the pre and post care for mob who have an admission. But it's actually largely the mental health that we hold in our community through our early intervention programs, our ongoing programs. And I wanted to note that, the Treasurer, really didn't answer Wendy's question, if I'm honest, dodged it. And because they've had an increase in the healthcare in the public sector, but what about the Aboriginal health workers and the Aboriginal health practitioners that are holding acuity and crisis in community because mob don't want to go to hospital for fear of lots of things? So I don't agree with it. I think that they'll consult when we already have the solutions in our communities. And that's where we'll get the best outcomes. So
what would you have preferred to see happen? All this money go, obviously it needs to be more, but how it gets targeted more effectively?
Fund Aboriginal community-controlled organisations. That's our health, our way. We are the solutions, and I think that COVID was a prime example of that. We quickly, and I can talk for Yerin Aboriginal Health Services. I'm not up here to talk on behalf of other organisations because that's another big mistake that the government makes. They think that one size fits all, and it doesn't. So our GPs and our Aboriginal workforce were quickly deployed before New South Wales Health even enacted their COVID response. We had our pandemic response plan happening before correspondence was even sent out. And unlike Lismore and other areas, I'm from the Central Coast Duncan country, and just to put context, we're the same size as geographical size as the ACT. And we're a very dispersed Aboriginal community, and the census that was released this week, 17,000 Aboriginal people live on Duncan country. And we're overlooked continually for those intervention services. But COVID, we were able to keep our community safe and launch vaccines and, make sure that mob that were sick. So ACOs. That's where you'll get your bang for buck.
Now, Esta, I'll go to you because Canterbury City Community Centre has done a lot of work through the pandemic as well, keeping people safe. Now, in terms of money coming to you and how it's distributed, you'll probably say something very similar to what Belinda just said. How would you like to see the funding and the assistance get to organisations like you so you can, work how you work?
Thank you. Great question. Whoever drafted it, thank you. I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that we're on. And as a child of migrants, I often say how embarrassed I am about very little information that I have or was ever taught in the public education system in New South Wales. And I work every day to try and rectify that lack of knowledge. So I think for me, I've been in the sector for many decades, and there's many, many friends in the audience who have been in the same situation and great people coming through the sector. And I think the critical thing for me heading up a local place-based service again, and I haven't done that for about 8 years, is that not much has changed, which is disappointing in a sense. And in some ways, I think we've actually gone backwards because what we're trying to do is implement project-based responses to critical issues that are quite systemic. So when the Treasurer, in his wisdom and his shadow, and it seems like he's been his shadow since the year 2001, both of them in their wisdom have a great sense of the macro kind of concepts and the macro issues, but those of us in this room understand the micro issues. And why I say not much has changed is we're still trying to assist people from the point of view of what the project KPIs actually expect us to deliver rather than what the people themselves need. And I think it's something that we have a real opportunity to change. And I started just before the lockdown, a couple of months before the lockdown, and what I realised very quickly was that, not only were people going back to local because they had to, once we came out of the lockdown, that trend is continuing. We developed great mutual respect with the department. The dialogue was fantastic. Dialogue with other organisations delivering was really open and honest. We supported each other. What I would like an incoming government of any persuasion to do is to continue that work. Let's not drop the ball, go back into our bunkers and then wait for the next opportunity or the next crisis. Let's keep that dialogue going. Place-based organisations, we know what we're good at. we can't do everything, but we know what we bring to the table. And I was saying to a colleague from Mission, a long-standing colleague, Nada, who's in the audience, was saying before that, you know, the kinds of collaborations that work are the kinds that actually respect what each other brings to the table. And I would love to see more of that, and I would love to see governments fund that, because what I've seen when I first headed up a not-for-profit in 97 is that I had base funding, I had infrastructure-based funding, I had security of funding, and that allowed me to innovate. It allowed me to take some risks. It allowed me to respond in the way the community needed. I'm not in that position now. I have to fit the boxes. And all of my colleagues up here, you know, from what you're saying, and those of you in the audience would be feeling this. And I think it stifles innovation. It really stifles testing and piloting new ideas. And on the theme of women from Angela, who's awesome, you know, the theme of women, one of my partners yesterday, day before, one of our partners, we just happened to cross each other in one of the rooms in the centre, and she's a teacher from one of our partner organisations. And I said to her, why are you guys in partnership with us? And she said, because if we expect the women that you're supporting to come to the college where it is, it just isn't going to happen. They come through these courses because they can do it in their community. And I think we have to get back to that place of respecting the strength that is available at the local level, and then working with the right partners to strengthen that and build it. But we can actually do it ourselves. And the biggest opportunity, and if we don't tackle it head on, it'll become an opportunity cost, is that these massive investments that are going to come, and they have, and congratulations to all levels of government for doing so, we can't just wait for the crumbs. Like, those resources have to come to us in a more direct way. And we need to be part of the project design of those responses, because that's the only way that our good colleagues in this room are going to be able to actually maximise that investment. There has to be a recognition that the people in this room are not just a sector. We are also consumers of these services. I live in my local community. The organisation I run is in the LGA that I live in. So I'm both a consumer and a sector leader. I'm not one or the other. And we have to listen to each other from a place of trust and mutual respect. And that's, I guess, what I would say to an incoming government.
Do you think that there has been any change in the dialogue or in the thinking post-pandemic, an acknowledgement that, hey, the government really needed these local services during that time?
Absolutely, and that's why I'm saying we enjoyed a really good dialogue. We're on Zooms all the time. We're exchanging ideas. We've got additional resources to sort of tap in and respond as quickly as we could. Well, that's what happens, right? As I said, everyone sort of bunkers back and everyone's busy. But I think that those systemic kind of dialogues have to continue, because then when something happens, everyone's ready to go. So I think that's an opportunity, absolutely.
Andrew, I'll go to you now. Just looking at the budget, the funding for housing, there was the Together Home program and the small amount for new housing for the First Nations community. Didn't include, which we've canvassed today, a lot for social housing. In your work, what are you seeing on the front line? What's the need? What has to happen here?
Well, the first thing I'd probably pose back to the Treasurer is social housing an issue in our state? Because from reading the budget outcomes in the summary, I don't think it is. Because you wouldn't think it is a crisis if you looked at the budget and you looked at the numbers within the budget. So from people who understand housing, maybe we overuse the word crisis, because the response is far from a crisis response, whether it's the North Coast or metropolitan Sydney or in Aboriginal communities around New South Wales. So I think there's, maybe I'll start though by saying I congratulate New South Wales government on their Together Home response, which was fundamentally a health response, which when you see a real crisis that was regarded as people could die, and this could impact everyone in society irrespective of where they sat in the food chain or how much money they had, this could affect the whole country and the whole state. You saw a real crisis response through Together Home, which is a health response to take street sleeping people into accommodation with wraparound supports and now look at permanent accommodation for them. So it was a fantastic crisis response. And I absolutely applaud New South Wales government for doing that. It's going to leave a legacy of positive outcomes for people. And I think I would link that to a report I've read fairly recently, which was just published by Housing All Australians, a report called Give Me Shelter, which states that by 2051, the lack of social housing is going to cost this country $25 billion per year if we don't address it. So I link what Angela was saying, and I agree wholeheartedly. If you want to run for Treasurer, Angela, I would certainly vote for you. You know, housing is a social responsibility. It's also economic infrastructure. And actually not supplying social housing in every community that needs it around Australia determines people's life chances at a lesser level, whether it's women escaping domestic violence, their children, people who are homeless, people who just are on a good job but don't earn enough money to access this incredibly hot Australian and overheated Australian housing market. It's a missed opportunity to have a fair society and a strong economy. So the response in the budget doesn't address that. The third thing I want to sort of say around the budget response, there isn't an innovation or a call to action about trying to do something differently. Putting $300 million into repairs for existing social housing starts to actually acknowledge that the existing system isn't working. Because what traditionally is happening is Land and Housing Corporation are having to sell stock to reinvest in existing stock. And it's a cycle of actually trying to keep the supply the same, because they're trying to ring fence the income and the expenditure without putting more investment in. So there's a maintenance backlog problem. So just maintaining the existing stock is hard for the existing government. The second thing is renewing that stock, because most of it is between 50 and 70 years old. So how do you replace that existing stock? And the third bit is, how do you increase supply to meet new consumers? So those three bits aren't going to be addressed by having very small amounts of money put in to supply an extra 320 social housing homes. So we need to have a bigger picture response that acknowledges that this isn't just a cost, it's an investment. And I crossed one of Sydney's beautiful bridges to get here. And in crossing that bridge, I was actually thinking around that report I mentioned earlier. Social housing in Australia has gone from 6% of Australia's housing stock to 4% of Australia's housing stock as the country's grown. So imagine as we continue to grow, we then take away Anzac Bridge and we think society is still going to operate. And then we continue to grow and we take away the Harbour Bridge. That's what it's like in the social housing sector. We're just not keeping pace with what this society needs to have a fair and functioning system and society. And it will impact the economy more and more and more by not providing social and affordable housing. So I didn't see a crisis response in the budget. I didn't really see even an effort of a response. I acknowledge the shared ownership. There's $780 million going into shared ownership, which is really healthy to see. If that response was part of a $3 billion response going into social housing supply, I would very much applaud that $780 million. But it needs to be as well as, not instead of. And at this very core, social housing is the most important form of housing. We need to address that undersupply.
And does it leave it quite vulnerable, especially in regional areas?
Look, some of my colleagues up in the North Coast, like North Coast Community Housing, I hear, and I see, and I speak to, colleagues, and it is, it's horrific. And some of my colleagues who are working in Northern Rivers, this needs a long-term systemic approach. And the opposition treasurer made a good point in terms of the cost of debt has been so low over the last couple of years that there was a great opportunity to start investing. But, I don't know who I'm quoting here, but 5 years ago was the best time to start this. The second best time is actually now. And to leverage in the federal government money that's coming in. There's $10 billion worth of federal government. New South Wales needs to think differently about how it supplies delivers its housing stock, not just rely on Treasury saying we've got $51 billion worth of social housing. Guess what? The market's gone up 20% or so. So now the value of social housing stock is 60 billion. Let's pat ourselves on the back. No, actually, all the fundamentals are the same. It's 50 years old. The state hasn't got enough money from its income from the social housing stock to repair it. It hasn't got enough money from its income to replace it, and it hasn't got enough money to expand it. So how do we look at things differently rather than just say it's an asset on the balance sheet and we're doing well as a state? Because we're not. We have to think about it differently. And when you look at the Northern Rivers area and other southeast Queensland as well, just going interstate a little bit, it has to be a bigger picture, more innovative response. Otherwise, all we do, as was mentioned earlier, we rename a funding program and we do exactly the same as what we know hasn't worked.
Is there a model somewhere else that works really well?
Look, there is. I mean, amazingly, in America, in Canada, in many places in Europe, they actually rely more on the not-for-profit sector to work with the private sector. And the government becomes a policy maker and it becomes a funder. And you layer in different forms of funding. And the community housing sector, which is really growing and emerging within New South Wales and Australia, can take a more pivotal role at layering land value, layering planning gain, working with builders and developers, and actually bringing in layers of funding and having local responses, as Esta and my other colleagues here were saying, to deliver local responses for local people, rather than thinking big government can provide everything in every community in the same way, because you have to be more nuanced and you have to be more proactive and reactive on the ground.
Thank you. Now, Jenni, I want to go back to you and talk about cost of living, energy prices, and especially there was the vouchers that were extended for around the energy assistance payments. And do you think that those rebates are helpful? And also, just in an organisation like yours, do people come to you for help? Is there problems accessing them as well?
Okay. It's always good to see increases in rebates, and you know, for the rebate to go up from 300 to 400, that's great. I guess one of the biggest challenges for our organisation is even though there's those rebates, we're not funded to deliver them. So during COVID, it moved to an online system. There was more accountability around that system and the information that organisations have to collect. There's also, you need an appointment, and to provide those energy rebates, an appointment takes an hour at least. Now, last year, my organisation, or this financial year, my organisation so far has approved, just in Lismore, $60,000 in rebates. So if you look at it in terms of $300 per person, if that's what they got, that's 200 appointments. Or if they got less than that, it's probably realistically between 200 and 400 appointments at an hour appointment. And there's no dollars at all attached to that program for administration. So it's once again a program that government is actually expecting us to deliver as a community neighbourhood centre or community organisation, and we're delivering it without any funding or very minimal funding to do it. So the EPA program is a great program and it supports people. I am fearful in Lismore right now, where we're actually, through a number of donations that we've received, we're giving people vouchers for heaters and electric blankets, and a number of people are living in their homes without internal cladding, and so they're not able to be closed up. So the unfortunate thing is, I think, with the cost of electricity going up, but also with without their being able to close their houses, their electricity bills are going to be enormous after this winter. We got, I think, the coldest winter, someone said the other day, since 1930, and it's freezing up on the North Coast right now, probably as cold as it is here in Sydney. But people are really looking to heat those houses, and it's going to be expensive.
Right, now I'd like to open up the discussion to people on the floor. Any questions for our panellists?
There we go. Thank you so much to all of you for your insights. I am so happy Andrew was on this panel, because the whole time we were talking about housing, I was like, no, none of this actually solves the problem. And I think, Andrew, thank you for your insight, because I think as as sector leaders, it is important for us to change the way we talk about social housing, because whenever politicians do it and they pitch solutions, they always make it sound like it's the problem of the poor people or those of us who are survivors or women or whatever. But it is very much a problem for the entire country, because that is what makes housing in Australia unaffordable, period. It is not a poor people need housing thing because they're sleeping in cars. Yes, it's a social responsibility and a human right, but it makes housing unaffordable in this country, period. And the solution is supply, not co-ownership or demand side. Yes, demand side, but the solution is supply. So thank you, Andrew. But my question was actually, we talked about funding going to smaller community providers or providers who are working on the ground with community, but might not be as big as national settlement services, for example. What do we propose is the solution to actually get the funding from state and even federal gov programs, because they will announce big budgets for certain projects, etc., but organizations like yours that are working with communities on the ground will get overlooked for various reasons that include grant and acquittal processes that are so extensive that it is just not even feasible for you to put in an application for a mere 100 grand or something. You know, how do we make that funding accessible to those organizations?
Who wants?
Yeah, I'd like to jump in on that, because as an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation, we get overlooked even more. And I think part of the problem is, and I actually made some notes when the Treasurer was talking, when we work with DCJ or other government bodies, and, you know, we're all on Tenderlink, you know, anxiously awaiting if there's some funding that we may be able to apply for. We're in the recommissioning phase right now, and, you know, there's lots of things happening. Two things that I'll respond with. The first one is that there's no appetite, because it's too hard for the government to make new decisions about where that funding could potentially go to. So they'll keep funding the same organisations and wonder why they're not getting any outcomes, particularly for Aboriginal communities, because Aboriginal people would much prefer coming into their Aboriginal organisations, and to your point around partnerships. But when you've got big legacy agencies that continue to have tender writing teams or relationships with people in government, those types of things, we will continually, and the smaller NGOs, non-Aboriginal NGOs, our neighbourhood centre, you know, experiences the same dilemmas. And I think Treasury are disjointed. They've got no idea. They sit over here and the Chief Procurement Officer says, no, we must do this. No, that's not a part of the procurement rules. So there's no innovation, there's no bigger picture thinking or an appetite to see if we, as the Aboriginal community controlled sector, can actually deliver on these services. Because what ultimately happens is that funding goes to the big non-Aboriginal agencies, and then mob come to us anyway. And we don't have the infrastructure or the administrative infrastructure and the back of house monies to be able to handle that. And then can I just mention that our organisation has over 200 KPIs and 17 contracts. That's ludicrous. Some of those are from the same department. So there's a system issue, and it's ritualistic behaviour that they hide behind and use the same rhetoric statements that, well, Aboriginal community controlled, or they don't have the capability because they're junior. Well, I'm telling you now that we've got Aboriginal organisations that are highly sophisticated and know their business.
I'd just like to add there as well, as a small NGO, we've got 17, 19 contracts, and we have individual profit and losses, report individually. The only reason we're actually innovative and able to respond flexibly on the ground is because we are small, we are not bureaucratic, and we're able to pull a little bit from here, a little bit from there, and a little bit from there, and be innovative. And I think that's, you know, we are responsive, and I think government needs to realise that that often you can, when you've got grassroots organisations, you look at the disasters that are happening, the floods in Lismore, who are the ones that are able to pick up and run with it and respond is the smaller grassroots. You look at the Koori Mail in Lismore, not a welfare organisation, but being able to set up in the middle of the CBD of Lismore and respond for Aboriginal people in an unbelievable way.
Is that on? I just want to thank you for the question and just say, I just want to reflect and celebrate the fact that the organisation I lead's actually been here for 50 years this year. We're not organisations that were just born yesterday. We're built from community for community, and I think that we have to start to talk about that again a bit more. And I've seen in my 30 years, you know, the way that funding has been reorganised, and I've worked and led organisations that have navigated that change, both large and small, and I see a role for everyone. There's enough work to do, but I think we can't continue to, I guess, pay less priority to the organisations that are locally based over organisations that aren't. I enjoy wonderful partnerships with organisations and have for many years that aren't in my local community because they bring something else. They add another bit to the puzzle. They've got a particular set of expertise and skills that we don't have. But it shouldn't come at a cost to the growth and opportunity that's afforded to my organisation and my community in Lakemba in place every day. And like I said before, we can't do everything, but we know what we can do well. And if you want to advance the economic participation of women, which I also celebrate so much great work that was led by Sam and I think Maha and Nemat are in the room and we're able to be part of consultations around the development of that statement. So I'm very excited by that. We haven't seen that kind of dialogue around women's advancement for a very long time at any level in government. So I think, you know, let's build on that. Organisations like mine are a window and a door for those women. They are women that are often highly marginalised, have very little information, little contacts, but have a massive capability and want to learn and participate. So why not build on that strength of that organisation? It's there, it's waiting. I think the 5.5% that Joanna announced and that the Treasurer talked about, that's just going to keep pace. It's fantastic, but it's also just necessary. It's part of, it should just be BAU. We shouldn't have to be doing a dance about it. You know, we know that consumers are dealing with a lot more costs in our households, in our families, in our individual budgets. And just on housing, only because I've been a councillor in a local government in Sydney, no one talks about the problems with supply in the private market. So I, as a councillor, approved a whole lot of development in my local community because I thought it was going to help affordability, because I was told supply was going to be the panacea and the market would take care of it, but the market didn't. So one of my legacies was approving thousands of units in Canterbury, which I'm still glad I did, but did they deliver affordable housing to the people that wanted to live in that area? Did they deliver social and community infrastructure to the people that were moving into that area? Did they deliver amenity? Did they deliver more schools? They didn't. So that's the other thing that we need to consider when we think about where we provide more affordable housing. I just touched into your bit, sorry.
Good segue, Esta. Look, a lovely question. Maybe I'll just address the first bit of that around, and I didn't really respond to your thinking about, Angela, your question as well, about where it's done elsewhere better. I think what we need to move to in New South Wales is trying to grab a bipartisan position on housing and actually look at supply. It's not just about housing supply numbers, it's around social and affordable housing supply as part of those numbers. So there needs to be state targets and local government targets, but there needs to be a target for a percentage of those to be social and affordable housing as part of the mix. And what I have seen done well elsewhere is where you get outcomes-based research, which you celebrate back with a Liberal or Conservative government, and you're not so reliant on having to wait for sugar hits of a 10-year change in government and then a reversion back. But you actually get a bipartisan picture where people say, actually, this isn't about politics. This is about social infrastructure and actually the stability and economic prosperity of the state, as opposed to whether it's a Labour or a Liberal sort of policy direction. This needs to be long-term bipartisan policy. And that's when I look back on my career, I think there's certain things that have happened where you go, okay, that's been done, and then it's been expanded, and there's been several change of government, and it's just continued. And to address the problem we've got, we probably need 30 years of continuous movement in the same direction, as opposed to 320 homes and that go by as a budget response, because 320 homes isn't a budget response to social housing shortfall.
Thank you. Anybody else has a question for the panel?
Hi, Heather Chaffee from Western Sydney Community Forum. It's just a question about climate change, just a small issue, but in reference to housing. And specifically, of course, I'm a Westie, born and bred, very passionate about that area. And Andrew, having worked with you before, you know that, in my understanding of the type of stock that we have in Western Sydney, the social housing stock that we have, and I hear the Treasurer say there's 300 million, I think I heard that right, for the maintenance of those properties. And my gut response is that's nowhere near enough. What I understand from the lived experiences of tenants in Western Sydney is that the standard of those properties is fairly poor. That's not on the community housing providers that run them currently. But it doesn't sound like nearly enough money to do that. I also understand that, we have a heat island, particularly in Penrith and the Hawkesbury region. And so the type of stock that we're going to need into the future will need to combat extreme heat. And of course, then in areas like the Upper Blue Mountains and Lithgow, we see pervasive issues around cold and more issues around mould in those properties because they're not, they're not to standard. They're not good enough. And I wonder what your thoughts are about this budget and its response to housing in terms of climate change.
I welcome the government spending 300 million or investing 300 million from outside of LAC's budget, because LAC have got, Land and Housing Corporation, have got an impossible conundrum to solve on their own if they're trying to finance the upgrade, the replacement and the increase in supply from their own cash flows. It's impossible to do that. So this extra 300 million coming in gives them a chance to address some of that backlog. So that's an encouraging factor. I saw a brilliant presentation a couple of weeks from the Climate Council, the CEO of the Climate Council, who's incredibly impressive. And what was talked about was for a new home being built now, to move it from a 6-star rating to a 7-star rating, how much energy is saved in that and the investment it's made over the long term. But then we talked around that in terms of how small the new supply is. At 2% per year of stock, it would take a long time. But if you look at social housing stock around the country, social housing stock, almost 400,000 homes, is probably around a 1-star rating. So we can actually focus more and more on people who are building their own homes or new homes construction in social and affordable housing, and that move from 6 to 7. But what about the 400,000 homes that are sitting on a 1, like you say, or even worse than a 1 if they haven't got internal walls because of crisis? So we do need to look at fuel poverty. We do need to look at how many people die, not just from heat, but it's a surprising number of people who die from cold in Australia. So there is a bigger thing there in terms of those 3 issues as I see them around existing social housing. How do you fund the repairs to existing stock? How do you fund the replacement of existing stock? And how do you fund the expansion? So those 3 things, Heather, I think you make a great point. We can't think of them in isolation, and we have to go macro, and we have to acknowledge there is a big funding gap and there is a big problem. That is not the case. It's not Matt Keane as Treasurer's problem to resolve. It's not, an incoming government. It's society. We have to step back and say, do we want to invest in this to make a long-term 20-year change? And that requires billions of dollars to be set aside every year, consistently for the next 30 years, to say, we believe this is essential. Otherwise, what we do is when the question was talked about in terms of people living in cars on the North Coast, people living in tents in the North Coast, I am a housing advocate and housing person for the last 30 years in social housing. I'm shocked and almost brought to tears actually by the number of stories I read and hear, because these aren't stories in the paper. These are real people living in tents with kids. These are real people struggling and wondering how they're going to feed. These are real people killing themselves because they've got no other options. So I'm quite distressed. If we have to really do something now, we can't just rely on pointing fingers, because it's a massive, massive problem.
Jenni, can I just jump in? What's happening in the Northern Rivers and Lismore? Are you seeing in any, what you're seeing, all the discussions that you're involved in, any talk about the plan going forward in the rebuilding, in addressing social housing and building proper housing in this big process that's happening up there?
Well, there is the Reconstruction Commission that's actually starting on 1st of July. At the moment, we really don't know what's happening. There's, I think I said before, 3,600 houses that are deemed uninhabitable. Doesn't mean, I think there's 340 something houses that are going to need major reconstruction, and there's probably about another 30 or 40 houses that people won't be able to move back into. So it's huge. Right now they've got a number of people who are being housed in pods in Wollongbar on a sporting field, and they have a number of people in caravan parks, in mobile home parks, in mobile RVs. If you look at Cabbage Tree Island, an Aboriginal community, or every house bar one, I think, is now uninhabitable. The school in Cabbage Tree Island's been damaged beyond repair. Richmond River High School in Lismore is beyond repair as well. So I think it's humanitarian. I mean, I actually, someone said to me the other day, this is a humanitarian crisis. It is huge. And not everyone wants to live in a pod at Wollongbar on a sporting field. Some people are choosing to live with family, but that's overcrowding in their families as well. Some people, like Wendy said, are choosing to be in a tent in their backyard in South Lismore. And some people have actually, because they don't have any other options, are actually living in their house without the cladding on it. So we don't know what's happening. We don't know whether there's going to be house and land swaps at this stage, whether people are going to have the choices to be able to make those, to be able to choose to swap their house or their land, or whether there's going to be other options. We had a huge rental crisis in Lismore pre-flood, and that was, particularly relevant during COVID, because a number of people were moving to regional areas and buying up the houses in regional areas, which was actually really increasing the rental prices, the rental market locally. So we had trouble finding houses for people pre-COVID and during COVID, that now it's an impossibility. There's no, people are out. So until this commission stands up, we really have no idea what choices people are going to have and where they go, and whether they'll be forced to make decisions that they don't want to. When you look at it in Lismore, it's just in Lismore, it's South Lismore, North Lismore, part of East Lismore, and the whole of the CBD. It's a whole two and a half suburbs of houses plus the CBD of displaced people within Australia, within New South Wales, and it's a disaster. In the CBD in Lismore, the City Council had a couple of years ago an incentive to create shop-top housing after the 2017 flood, and so they were really promoting for people to build units above the houses in the CBD. And in the 74 flood, the flood went just underneath the second floor, but in this flood, 2 metres higher, those units were devastated. And so, and those places, I understand, primarily shops, units are owned by local people. They're not owned by investors. They're owned by local, outside investors, from outside the region. They're owned by local people. So it's, we have no idea until this commission stands up what's going to happen.
Thanks, Jenni. Now, unfortunately, we've run out of time. So can we thank our amazing panellists and thank you for your time this morning. Sorry, Esta wants to get the final word in quickly.
I'm just going to make one point. I think both of them said that base funding, they weren't sure it could be done because we can't control the markets and global inflation. Well, I think the Queensland government was working against the same markets in the budget they just announced. And they announced base funding to 127 neighbourhood and community centres, an increase from 124,000 each to 230,000 each. And it was the biggest investment ever that the New South Wales government's made into community and neighbourhood centres. Queensland has made. Thank you, Joanna. So why can't an incoming government do that? Sorry, I had to say it.
Thank you.